Imagine this. You're a Roman soldier standing guard on the northern border of Italy. It's 218 BC, and you've been told that the Alps, those massive, snow-covered mountains behind you, are your greatest offense. No army could possibly cross them. They're impassable, especially with siege weapons, supplies, and wait, did that scout just say elephants? You laugh it off. Elephants? In the Alps? Impossible. But then you see them, emerging from a mountain passes like ghosts from a nightmare. Thousands of battle-hardened warriors, cavalry units, and towering war elephants, their trunks trumpeting across the valleys. Leading them is a man who swore an oath as a 9-year-old boy to be Rome's eternal enemy. A man who will bring the Roman Republic to its knees. A man named Hannibal Barca. Welcome to the most audacious military campaign in ancient history. A story of genius, vengeance, and the indomitable will of one man who refused to accept the word impossible. Our story begins not in the snowy Alps, but in the sun-scorched lands of North Africa. The year is 247 BC, and Carthage, one of the ancient world's greatest maritime powers, is locked in a death struggle with Rome in what history would call the First Punic War. Hannibal Barca was born into this conflict. His father, Hamilcar Barca, was one of Carthage's most brilliant generals. The name Barca meant lightning, and Hamilcar lived up to it. He was a military innovator, a fierce warrior, and a man consumed by one purpose: the defeat of Rome. But here's where our story takes a dramatic turn. According to the ancient historian Polybius, when Hannibal was just 9 years old, his father was preparing to leave for a campaign in Spain. Young Hannibal begged to come along. Hamilcar agreed, but only on one condition. Picture this scene. In a sacred temple, before the altar of the Carthaginian gods, Hamilcar makes his young son place his hand on the sacrificial victim. Hannibal must swear a solemn oath to never be a friend to Rome, to be Rome's enemy for life. Can you imagine? A 9-year-old boy swearing eternal hatred against the greatest power in the Mediterranean. Most kids that age are playing games. Hannibal was pledging his life to vengeance, and he never forgot that oath. After his father died when Hannibal was 18, the young man didn't inherit the command immediately. That went to his brother-in-law, Hasdrubal the Fair. But Hannibal was already proving himself as an extraordinary warrior and tactician. He fought in Spain, learned the terrain, understood the tribal politics, and most importantly, he studied warfare with an obsessive intensity. When Hasdrubal was assassinated in 221 BC, the army didn't hesitate. They proclaimed the 26-year-old Hannibal as their commander. This wasn't nepotism. This was recognition of pure military genius. But what made Hannibal different from other generals of his era? Let me tell you, it was his mind. While other commanders relied on brute force and overwhelming numbers, Hannibal was playing chess while they were playing checkers. He understood psychology. He knew that defeating an enemy wasn't just about killing their soldiers. It was about breaking their will, outsmarting their strategies, and turning their strengths into weaknesses. He also had an incredible ability to inspire loyalty. His troops, composed of Carthaginians, Numidians, Iberians, Celts, and others, came from dozens of different cultures and spoke different languages. Yet Hannibal welded them into a unified fighting force. How? He shared their hardships. He ate the same food, slept in the same conditions, and fought on the front lines beside them. Ancient historians record that Hannibal often slept on the ground wrapped in a simple military cloak, no different from his common soldiers. He was first into battle, and last to leave the battlefield. This wasn't just leadership. This was brotherhood. By 219 BC, tensions between Carthage and Rome had reached a boiling point. The flashpoint was a city called Saguntum, located on the eastern coast of Spain. It was technically in Carthaginian territory, but Rome claimed it as an ally. Hannibal laid siege to Saguntum, and this is where we see his military brilliance combined with his ruthlessness. The siege lasted 8 months. The people of Saguntum, expecting Roman rescue that never came, fought desperately. When the city finally fell, it was annihilated. Rome demanded that Carthage hand over Hannibal for punishment. Carthage refused. The Second Punic War had begun. Now, here's what's fascinating. Rome expected the war to be fought in Spain and Africa. They had control of the sea, so they figured they'd simply sail their armies to the battlefields. Hannibal was supposedly trapped in Spain, separated from Italy by the massive Alps and hundreds of miles of hostile territory. But Hannibal had other plans, plans that would change military history forever. In the spring of 218 BC, Hannibal assembled his army, approximately 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and here's the kicker, 37 war elephants. His plan? March from Spain, through southern Gaul, modern-day France, across the Alps, and invade Italy from the north. Let that sink in. He was going to take elephants over the Alps. Military experts of the time said it was impossible. The Romans certainly thought so. That's exactly why Hannibal did it. The march began with 90,000 men. By the time they reached the Rhone River, they'd already fought through hostile tribes and difficult terrain. Crossing the Rhone with elephants is a story in itself. The animals were terrified of water. Hannibal's solution? Build massive rafts, cover them with dirt so the elephants thought they were still on solid ground, and float them across. Ingenious. But the Rhone was nothing compared to what lay ahead. As autumn approached, Hannibal's army reached the foothills of the Alps. The exact route he took is still debated by historians. Some say the Col de Clapier, others suggest Mont Cenis or the Col de la Traversette. What we know for certain is that the crossing was hell. The Alpine tribes, fierce mountain warriors who knew every treacherous pass, harassed the Carthaginian column. They'd roll boulders down on the marching troops, attack the rear guard, and disappear into the peaks. Hannibal had to fight for every mile. Then came the snow. Early winter storms turned the mountain passes into death traps. The paths became sheets of ice. Men and animals slipped and fell thousands of feet to their deaths. The cold was so severe that soldiers suffered frostbite and hypothermia. Food ran out. The army began eating their pack animals. And the elephants, those massive war elephants that were supposed to terrify the Romans, they suffered terribly. Their feet weren't designed for ice and snow. They grew weak from lack of food. One by one, they began to die. Here's a detail that gives you chills. At one point, the army encountered a section where an avalanche had completely destroyed the path. There was literally no way forward. The cliff was too steep, the rock too hard. Most commanders would have turned back. Hannibal? He had his men heat the rock with fire and then pour vinegar on it, a technique that caused the limestone to crack and crumble. His engineers then carved a path wide enough for the elephants to pass. The crossing took 15 days. 15 days of hell. When Hannibal finally descended into the valley in northern Italy, his army was a shadow of what it had been. Of the 90,000 men who left Spain, only about 26,000 remained. 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. Of the 37 elephants, sources vary, but most agree that fewer than a dozen survived. But they had done the impossible. They had crossed the Alps, and now they were in Italy. The Romans were caught completely off guard. Their armies were in Spain and Sicily, preparing to take the war to Carthage. Suddenly, there was an enemy army in northern Italy, and Rome's first response was confusion mixed with disbelief. The Roman commander Publius Cornelius Scipio, father of the general who would eventually defeat Hannibal, rushed north with whatever forces he could gather. The two armies met at the Ticinus River in late 218 BC. It wasn't even a contest. Hannibal's Numidian cavalry, arguably the finest horsemen in the ancient world, destroyed the Roman cavalry. Scipio himself was wounded and nearly killed. He was saved only by his teenage son, who charged back in the fray to rescue him. The Romans retreated, shocked. They'd been defeated by an army that was supposed to be dying in the mountains. But this was just the beginning. A month later, at the Trebia River, Hannibal set a trap that showcased his tactical genius. He understood Roman psychology. He knew they were aggressive, that they believed in Roman superiority, and that they'd take the bait. Here's how it played out. Hannibal sent a small cavalry force to harass the Roman camp at dawn. The Roman commander, Sempronius, was furious. His men hadn't eaten. They'd been roused from sleep, but Roman pride demanded immediate action. He ordered his entire army, about 40,000 men, to ford the freezing Trebia River and engage, exactly as Hannibal planned. While the Romans were crossing the icy river, Hannibal had hidden his brother Mago with 2,000 elite troops in a gully. As the Roman army advanced, cold and exhausted from the river crossing. Hannibal's main force engaged them from the front. Then Mago's hidden force attacked from the rear. The Romans were surrounded. It was a massacre. Nearly 30,000 Roman soldiers were killed or captured. Only about 10,000 escaped. Rome was reeling. In less than 2 months, Hannibal had destroyed 2 Roman armies. Panic spread through the city. Winter came, and the campaigning season ended. The Romans used this time to elect new consuls and raise new armies. They were confident that in the spring, with their superior numbers and resources, they'd crush this upstart Carthaginian. They were wrong. In June of 217 BC, Hannibal led the Roman consul Flaminius into the most perfect ambush in military history. The setting was Lake Trasimene in central Italy. Hannibal knew Flaminius was pursuing him. He also knew Flaminius was rash, eager for glory, and would take risks to catch the Carthaginian army. So Hannibal set the stage. He marched his army past Lake Trasimene, along a narrow valley road with the lake on one side and hills on the other. Then he doubled back under cover of darkness and positioned his entire army in the hills overlooking the road. Morning came. A thick fog rolled in from the lake, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Flaminius, eager to catch Hannibal, marched his army into the valley without proper scouting. Can you imagine being a Roman soldier that morning? You're marching in fog, so thick you can barely see the man in front of you. The lake is on your right, hills on your left. You hear nothing but the sound of thousands of feet marching, the creak of armor, the jingle of weapons. Then, without warning, a war cry erupts from the hills. Thousands of Carthaginian warriors come pouring down from all sides. You're trapped between the hills and the lake. There's nowhere to run. The battle, if you can even call it that, lasted 3 hours. It was pure slaughter. 15,000 Romans died, including Consul Flaminius himself. Another 15,000 were captured. Hannibal lost about 1,500 men. Rome had lost 3 armies in less than a year. The city itself seemed vulnerable. After Trasimene, Rome realized they couldn't beat Hannibal in open battle, so they tried something different. They appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator, giving him total authority to conduct the war. Fabius had a radical strategy: don't fight Hannibal. Instead, shadow his army, harass his foragers, cut off his supplies, and avoid pitched battles at all costs. Essentially, wait for Hannibal to run out of resources and go home. The Romans called Fabius cunctator, the delayer. It was meant as an insult, but it was actually brilliant strategy. For months, this approach worked. Hannibal couldn't force Fabius to fight, and without a decisive victory, he couldn't break Rome's alliance system. But here's the problem with defensive strategies. They require patience, and people aren't patient, especially when an enemy army is ravaging their countryside. The Roman people grew frustrated. They wanted action, victory, vengeance. So when Fabius's term ended, the Romans elected 2 new consuls who promised to destroy Hannibal once and for all: Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus. The stage was set for Hannibal's masterpiece. August 2nd, 216 BC. The city of Cannae in southern Italy. This is where Hannibal would fight the battle that military academies still study today, the perfect example of tactical genius. The Romans assembled the largest army in their history, approximately 86,000 men, including 8 legions. They were done being cautious. They would crush Hannibal through sheer numerical superiority. Hannibal had about 50,000 men, significantly outnumbered. Any normal general would have been terrified. Hannibal was excited. Here's what makes Cannae extraordinary. Hannibal knew exactly how the Romans would fight. Roman tactics relied on the strength of their infantry. They'd form a massive block, advance forward, and grind down the enemy through sustained pressure. It was brutally effective, like a steamroller of shields and swords. So Hannibal gave them exactly what they expected, with a twist. He arranged his army in a crescent formation. His weak Spanish and Celtic infantry formed the center, deliberately thin and pushed forward. His elite African infantry were on the flanks, pulled back. His cavalry was on the wings. When the battle began, the Roman army did exactly what Hannibal expected. They saw that weak center and attacked it with their full force. The Spanish and Celtic warriors in the center began to give ground, slowly retreating, the crescent formation bending inward. From the Roman perspective, they were winning. They were pushing the enemy back. They pressed forward harder, their massive formation compacting as they pursued. But that's exactly what Hannibal wanted. As the Romans pushed deeper into the center, Hannibal's African infantry on the flanks wheeled inward, attacking the Romans from both sides. Simultaneously, his cavalry defeated the Roman cavalry on the wings and circled around to attack the rear. The Romans suddenly realized they weren't winning. They were trapped, surrounded on all sides. The formation that had been their strength now became their coffin. They were packed so tightly that most couldn't even lift their weapons. What followed was the worst defeat in Roman history. Over the course of several hours, approximately 50,000 to 70,000 Romans were killed. Consul Paulus died on the battlefield. Hundreds of Roman senators and equestrians, the cream of Roman society, were slaughtered. Hannibal lost about 6,000 men. To put this in perspective, Rome lost more men in a single afternoon at Cannae than the United States lost in the entire Vietnam War. It was catastrophic. The military perfection of Cannae has echoed through history. German Field Marshal Alfred von Schlieffen studied it before World War I. Norman Schwarzkopf referenced it during the Gulf War. It's the gold standard of tactical excellence. After Cannae, Hannibal's cavalry commander Maharbal famously said to him, "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but you don't know how to use one. March on Rome now, and in 5 days you'll be dining on the Capitoline Hill." Hannibal didn't march on Rome. This decision has puzzled historians for over 2,000 years. Why didn't he finish the job? There are several theories. First, Hannibal's army, while victorious, was exhausted and lacked siege equipment. Rome's walls were formidable, and a siege would require resources he didn't have. Second, Hannibal's strategy wasn't to conquer Rome. It was to break Rome's confederation of allies. He hoped that after Cannae, Rome's Italian allies would defect to his side, leaving Rome isolated. Some allies did defect, notably Capua, the second largest city in Italy, but most remained loyal to Rome. This was Hannibal's great miscalculation. He underestimated Roman resilience and the loyalty Rome inspired. Rome, facing annihilation, refused to surrender. They implemented a scorched earth policy. They raised new armies, enlisting slaves, young boys, even criminals. They instituted a war economy. Every resource was dedicated to survival. The Senate famously refused to even discuss peace or ransom prisoners. When Hannibal sent ambassadors to negotiate, Rome wouldn't receive them. When survivors from Cannae returned home, instead of celebrating their survival, Rome punished them. These men had failed, and Rome didn't forgive failure. This Roman stubbornness, this absolute refusal to accept defeat, would ultimately doom Hannibal. For the next 13 years, Hannibal remained in Italy, an undefeated general trapped in enemy territory. He won more battles. He outmaneuvered Roman armies, but he couldn't deliver the knockout blow. Meanwhile, Rome slowly bled him dry. The Romans, learning from Fabius, avoided direct confrontation when possible. They recaptured allied cities that had defected to Hannibal. They cut off his supply lines. They sent armies to Spain to attack Carthaginian territories there, forcing Carthage to divide its resources. Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal tried to bring reinforcements from Spain, even attempting his own crossing of the Alps. But the Romans intercepted and destroyed his army at the Battle of the Metaurus River in 207 BC. According to legend, the Romans catapulted Hasdrubal's severed head into Hannibal's camp. Hannibal, looking at his brother's head, reportedly said, "I see they're the fate of Carthage." He was right. Meanwhile, a young Roman general was rising through the ranks. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio, the same teenage boy who had saved his father at the Battle of Ticinus. Scipio had studied Hannibal's tactics obsessively. He understood that to defeat Hannibal, Rome needed to think like Hannibal. Scipio took command of Roman forces in Spain and systematically dismantled Carthaginian power there. But he didn't stop there. In a bold move that mirrored Hannibal's strategy, Scipio convinced Rome to let him invade Africa. He would take the war to Carthage's homeland, forcing them to recall Hannibal to defend the city. It worked. In 203 BC, after 15 years in Italy, 15 years of being undefeated in battle, Hannibal was ordered to return to Africa. Carthage was under threat, and they needed their greatest general. Imagine Hannibal's feelings as he left Italy. He'd won every major battle. He'd killed more Roman soldiers than any enemy in history. Yet, he was leaving without achieving his goal. Rome still stood, bloody but unbroken. In 202 BC, Hannibal and Scipio finally face each other at the Battle of Zama near Carthage. This was the showdown the ancient world had been waiting for. The two greatest generals of their age. Scipio had learned from Hannibal. He'd studied canny, understood the importance of cavalry, and knew he couldn't beat Hannibal in a straightforward fight. So he adapted. The battle began with Hannibal unleashing his war elephants, about 80 of them. But Scipio had prepared for this. He opened lanes in his formations, allowing the elephants to charge through harmlessly. Roman trumpets and javelins panicked many of the beasts, who turned and trampled their own troops. When the infantry lines clashed, it was brutal and even. Both commanders were tactical geniuses, and neither could gain a decisive advantage in the center. But then came the decisive moment. Scipio's cavalry, led by his Numidian allies, defeated Hannibal's cavalry and then, in a move straight from Hannibal's playbook at Kenny, circled around and attacked Hannibal's army from behind. Hannibal was beaten by his own tactics. The Carthaginian army collapsed. Thousands were killed or captured. Hannibal himself barely escaped with his life. For the first time in his military career, Hannibal Barca had lost a battle. The peace terms were devastating. Carthage had to surrender all but 10 of its warships, pay massive indemnities to Rome, and agree never to wage war without Roman permission. Carthage, once Rome's greatest rival, was reduced to a client state. Hannibal, now in his mid-40s, had lost everything he'd fought for, but he didn't give up. He turned his genius to politics and governance. As Suffete, chief magistrate of Carthage, he reformed the government, restructured the economy, and worked to pay off the war debt to Rome. He was actually succeeding. Carthage began to recover, but Rome couldn't tolerate even a prosperous Carthage, and they especially couldn't tolerate Hannibal being alive and influential. Roman politicians, particularly Cato the Elder, constantly agitated against Carthage. Cato famously ended every speech in the Senate with Carthago delende est, Carthage must be destroyed. In 195 BC, Rome demanded that Carthage hand over Hannibal. Rather than submit, Hannibal fled into exile. For the next 13 years, Hannibal wandered the eastern Mediterranean, always one step ahead of Roman assassins. He served various kingdoms, Antioch, Armenia, Crete, offering his military genius to anyone who would oppose Rome. But Rome never forgot him. They hounded him relentlessly, seeing him as the greatest threat to Roman power even in his 60s. Finally, in 183 BC, Roman agents tracked Hannibal to Bithynia, in modern-day Turkey. He was staying with King Prusias, who had promise and protection. But when the Romans arrived with an ultimatum, Prusias betrayed him. Hannibal, now 64 years old, realized he was cornered. Roman soldiers surrounded his villa. There was no escape. Rather than be captured and paraded through Rome in chains, the ultimate humiliation for a Roman enemy, Hannibal took poison he'd kept hidden for years, specifically for this moment. His last words were reportedly, "Let us relieve the Romans from the anxiety they have so long experienced, since they think it tries their patience too much to wait for an old man's death." Even in death, Hannibal denied Rome the satisfaction of defeating him on their terms. So, why does Hannibal's story still matter? Over 2,200 years later? Because Hannibal Barca represents something fundamental about the human spirit: the refusal to accept limitations. Everyone told him crossing the Alps was impossible. He did it anyway. Everyone said he couldn't defeat Rome with a smaller army. He won the most perfect tactical victory in military history. Everyone expected him to quit, to surrender, to accept defeat. He fought for 17 years in enemy territory, without a single defeat in major battle. But Hannibal's story is also a tragedy. It's about the limits of individual genius. Despite his brilliance, despite his victories, he couldn't overcome Roman resilience, resources, and resolve. He won every battle but lost the war. Military leaders throughout history have studied Hannibal. Napoleon called him the greatest general who ever lived. George S. Patton kept a copy of Livy's account of the Second Punic War with him during World War II. Norman Schwarzkopf modeled his left hook strategy in Desert Storm partially on Cannae. The Battle of Cannae specifically remains the gold standard of military tactics, the perfect double envelopment. Every military academy in the world teaches it. It's the battle every general wants to recreate, and every general fears will be used against them. But beyond military tactics, Hannibal's story teaches us about determination, creativity, and the price of vengeance. That oath he swore as a 9-year-old boy defined his entire life. It gave him purpose, drive, and ultimately tragedy. He achieved incredible things, but in the end, his quest for vengeance consumed him. There's also something deeply human about Hannibal's final years. The warrior became a fugitive, the genius reduced to offering his services to minor kings, the man who changed history died alone in exile, taking poison rather than face capture. Before we wrap up, let's address one of the most controversial questions. How many elephants actually survived the Alpine crossing, and what happened to them? Ancient sources disagree. Some say all died within a year due to the Italian climate and wounds sustained in battle. Others suggest a handful survived for several years, perhaps even fighting at Cannae. Archaeological evidence hasn't definitively resolved the question. But here's what we know. The elephants were more than weapons. They were psychological warfare. Imagine being a Roman farmer, having never seen anything larger than a cow, suddenly encountering a creature 3 times the size of a horse, with a trunk and tusks. It was terrifying. The elephants also symbolized Hannibal's audacity. Bringing them over the Alps wasn't practical. It was a statement. It said, I can do the impossible. That's very Hannibal. Let's indulge in some speculation. What if Hannibal had marched on Rome after Cannae? What if he'd had siege equipment? What if more Italian allies had defected? If Rome had fallen, the entire trajectory of Western civilization changes. There's no Roman Empire. Christianity likely doesn't spread as it did. The legal systems, languages, and cultures of Europe developed completely differently. Modern Western civilization, as we know it, might not exist. Instead, we might live in a world shaped by Carthaginian culture, more mercantile, more maritime, possibly more diverse given Carthage's multicultural nature. The Latin language might be a historical footnote, replaced by Punic derivatives. It's fascinating to consider. The whole modern world might have hinged on Hannibal's decision not to march on Rome, and Rome's stubborn refusal to surrender. Ancient historians give us glimpses of Hannibal the man, not just the general. He was described as having extraordinary physical endurance, often the first to rise and last to sleep. He was apparently not particularly tall or physically imposing, but his presence commanded respect. He was multilingual, speaking Punic, Greek, and likely picking up Latin and Celtic during his campaigns. He was educated in Greek philosophy and literature. His tutor was a Spartan named Sosilas, who actually wrote a history of Hannibal's campaigns, sadly lost to history. Despite his reputation for ruthlessness in war, Hannibal was reportedly honorable in his personal dealings. He kept his promises, treated prisoners with respect when practical, and was faithful to his allies. But make no mistake, when war demanded it, Hannibal could be brutal. Ancient accounts describe him flooding mines to drown Roman soldiers, using psychological tactics to terrify enemies, and showing no mercy to cities that resisted him. He was complex, brilliant but tragic, honorable but ruthless, visionary but ultimately doomed by circumstances beyond his control. Military historians love to debate. Was Hannibal the greatest general who ever lived? The case for Hannibal is strong. He fought outnumbered for nearly 2 decades in enemy territory without a defeat. He won the most perfect tactical battle in history. He revolutionized military strategy and tactics. The case against is equally strong. He ultimately lost the war. He failed to achieve his strategic objectives. His victories, however brilliant, didn't translate to lasting success. Compare him to Alexander the Great, who conquered the known world, or to Genghis Khan, who built the largest land empire in history, or to Napoleon, who dominated Europe for over a decade. But here's my take. Hannibal fought under the most difficult circumstances of any great general. Alexander inherited a trained army and a stable kingdom. Caesar had Rome's resources. Napoleon had a nation behind him. Hannibal had a mercenary army fighting in enemy territory with minimal support from home against an enemy with inexhaustible manpower and resources. The fact that he came close to winning under those conditions is perhaps more impressive than Alexander's conquests or Caesar's triumphs. But you can make up your own mind. That's part of what makes Hannibal's story so compelling. It provokes debate and inspires discussion even after 2,200 years. Let's circle back to where we started. A 9-year-old boy in a Carthaginian temple, swearing eternal enmity to Rome. That moment defined Hannibal's entire life. It gave him purpose, drove him to incredible achievements, and ultimately led to his downfall. It's both inspiring and cautionary. Think about it. How many of us at 9 years old make decisions that shape our entire lives? How many of us commit to something with such absolute dedication that we'd spend 45 years pursuing it, even when it costs us everything? Hannibal's oath is a reminder of the power of commitment, for better and worse. It produced one of history's greatest military minds. It also produced a life defined by war, ending in lonely exile. Maybe that's the real lesson of Hannibal. Greatness comes with a price. The same dedication that makes extraordinary achievements possible can also trap us in cycles of our own making. Hannibal became exactly what that 9-year-old boy swore to be, Rome's greatest enemy. He kept his oath until his dying breath. Whether that's noble or tragic, perhaps it's both. Closing question. So here's what I want you to think about. If you were Hannibal at Cannae, standing over the greatest military victory in ancient history, looking at the road to Rome, would you march on the city? Would you risk everything on one final gamble? Or would you stick to the strategic plan even knowing, as we do with hindsight, that won't ultimately work? It's easy to second-guess from 2,200 years in the future. But in that moment, with imperfect information, exhausted troops, and no siege equipment, what would you do? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed diving deep into one of history's most fascinating figures, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We got more incredible historical stories coming your way. Stories of genius and tragedy, triumph and defeat, of people who changed the world and the human cost of their ambition. Hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and join us as we explore the real stories that shaped our world. Because history isn't just dates and battles. It's human drama at its finest. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next